Hi, this is Sean Perrin, and you're listening to episode 19 of the Clarinet podcast. This episode is brought to you by D'Addario Woodwinds. Sanding, shaping, balancing. For centuries, mastering your instrument meant mastering these crafts too. But now, D'Addario is redefining craftsmanship for the 21st century by refining their reeds and mouthpieces with technology built from the ground up. By using the world's most innovative techniques to deliver consistently what was once made variable by hand, D'Addario ensures excellence right out of the box as standard, not a surprise. So you can spend less time sanding, shaping, and balancing, and more time perfecting your own craft. To learn more about the new era of craftsmanship from D'Addario Woodwinds, visit d'addario.com/woodwinds. Today, our guest on the podcast is Ed Joffe, who is returning for the final part in a 3-part series. If you haven't checked out part 1 and 2, I would highly recommend doing so. Ed is an incredibly knowledgeable man, and we covered a ton of fantastic subjects, including his new CD called Contrasts, tips for clarinet players interested in doubling, the fascinating history of woodwind doubling in the orchestra and other ensembles, and his amazing book called Woodwind Doubling for Saxophone, Clarinet, and Flute. In this episode, we focus mainly on Ed's nearly 40 years of experience as a versatile Broadway musician. The giveaway for this series of episodes is a signed copy of Ed's new CD called Contrasts. If you'd like to be eligible to win items mentioned on the podcast, be sure to head to clarinet.com and subscribe to the e-newsletter. In addition to getting a chance to win this and other exciting giveaways, you'll receive content updates, exclusive product coupons, special offers, and more. If you'd like to purchase a copy of Ed's new CD or book, there are links on the show notes that go directly to Ed's website. Alternatively, you can head right to joffewoodwinds.com. Joffe is spelled Joffe. Before we get started, I'd like to feature one more selection from Ed's upcoming album. This one exemplifies Ed's doubling abilities on flute and clarinet perfectly because he's actually layering the recording in such a way that he played both instruments. I personally can't stop listening to this track. It's just gorgeous. The arrangement is incredible, and I hope that you enjoy it. Here's Ed Joffe performing Variations on an Autumn Theme. So welcome to the Clarinet.com podcast for the third time here, Ed. I'm so glad to have you back on the show today. And today's episode, we are going to focus on Broadway and being a Broadway musician.
Yes. Well, that's been a major part of my career as far as sustained work and work that, allowed me to survive here in New York for in my entire life.
You said you've been playing more than 40 years in this type of act throughout New York?
Somewhere in the late 70s, I began subbing on Broadway, so it's probably not quite 40, maybe 37, 38 years, but it's enough time.
Pretty close. How has the industry changed and the way that the public receives it, and maybe the history, maybe a little bit of the Broadway, even before you got there? You're the history guy.
Well, I don't know about that, but when I was going to school as an undergrad, and I remember doing a production of Company, Stephen Sondheim musical, in school when I was a senior, an undergraduate senior. And it was a lot of fun. We did I believe a full week of productions, and there was a week or two of rehearsals. And it's a lovely musical, and I was playing the lead book, which had, I think several saxophones, clarinet, flute, piccolo, and there was even some blowing at the end of the show where, I don't know if that was in Broadway, but certainly in the books that we had, they'd open it up for jazz at the end of the show on the exit music. So I thought, wow, this is pretty fun. And I never considered that type of career, going to school as a music major. I really didn't have a good focus on what the music industry was, to be honest with you. they never talked about the music business in school at the time, at least in the school that I went to. And making a living as a full-time musician, I mean, it was sort of a nebulous thing. I was doing club dates or casuals where you'd play for dinner dancers, or maybe little affairs, weddings, bar mitzvahs, things like that. But didn't really have a clue. I knew about orchestral gigs and the orchestral world, but that other area called commercial music was very vague to me. So Broadway suddenly became a possibility after doing the show in college because they said, well, if you do a Broadway show, you can do a lot of other jobs. You can take off up to 50% of the time. That means you could hold the job at the show and take off whenever you got called for other work. And I thought, wow, that's pretty good. And you can play all your instruments and even improvise. Little did I know that very uh, positive experience I had in college was probably going to be the most positive experience I ever had with a show in the years to follow, because the conductor was terrific. He was a wonderful composer. He's still around, named Bruce Saylor. He's a serious classical composer and fine educator. He made the show fun. The cast was terrific. The whole dynamic was great. When I started doing Broadway or looking to do Broadway for a living more, then you start to get a real sense of what it is to be in the music business. Um, when I started in the late 1970s, Broadway was a gig for either very young players looking to enter the industry like I was, or players who were sort of on the back end of their careers. And that was simply because there was so much work, certainly in New York. The recording industry was still thriving. Freelance work was terrific. One-nighters all over. Every hotel had a band or several bands. So really, there was so much work that if you were a top player, doing a Broadway show was a demerit in the late 70s. Quite frankly, it was just above doing club dates. I mean, if you
Wow.
didn't do weddings or bar mitzvahs, then maybe Broadway was what you did. But if you were a studio musician or an orchestral musician or one of the top freelance players, you just didn't do Broadway then because it didn't pay as well. And who wanted to be stuck playing the same music every night, quite frankly? That was the industry that I entered. But I have to say, in the, well, almost 40 years now since, things have changed dramatically. And that's what I think the listening public, especially young players, need to be aware of, is how dramatic the change is and what it means to do Broadway, how to get a gig on Broadway, and how to maybe survive on Broadway.
So how would one get a gig on Broadway? Because I know, and a lot of people know through their training at university, that to get an orchestral job, you just go and audition, and well, I don't mean you just go and audition. You do go and audition, and then you just hope to get something someday. But how does it work with Broadway? Do you show up somewhere similar and give it a try, or how do you get into that sort of
Yeah, well,
circle?
therein lies the big question. Uh, in New York, where the Broadway theater is most prevalent of any city in the country, uh, it is illegal to audition musicians for a production. Uh,
It is
It is
illegal.
illegal. It's against the bylaws of Local 802.
That's totally backwards from the orchestral world, no?
Exactly. So then, how does one get into Broadway? And it's simple and yet complicated. You need to establish your name among your colleagues. In other words, you have to have a network of people who will begin to use you as subs. Now, that sounds rather straightforward, but subbing is no longer that easy on Broadway. I mean, I'm not trying to make it hard. I'm just trying to be realistic and present the true facts. Years ago, by years ago, I mean, let's say 5 years ago, uh, musicians could still take off legally and hold their job on Broadway up to 50% of the time. And that was okay as long as there was enough work. But there's been a change in our healthcare system in the United States. and certainly for musicians. And in order to qualify for the healthcare plans, you need to average a little over 6 shows a week. In other words, every Broadway show, musical, generally does 8 shows a week. So now you sort of need to be there about 75% of the time, assuming you don't have any other work that will pay into the healthcare fund, in order to qualify for the better healthcare plans and hospitalization fund. That means subbing is now not as available to people who don't have a show as it once was. So that restricts the amount of people who might be subbing. Now, you have to sort of know some of the players who are doing the shows on your instruments and hope that they are impressed enough with you as a player to consider you for, subbing work. Now the question is, how do you meet those players? Well, I always tell younger players that the best way to do that is to be direct and honest with people who play your instrument. Find out who's playing those shows. Maybe go to some shows. Look at the playbill. Come down to the pit. Try to meet the players, and explain that you're new in town, that you like to do this work, that you would like to play for them. Take a lesson from them or several, but be upfront. Don't just take a lesson and figure you're going to wow them. Because let's face it, we're in New York, and there are a lot of great players here, and a lot of wonderful players come to New York just to work here. But be direct with the player. Take some lessons from a number of people on your instrument or instruments, and ask them to assess your playing. Find out what they think of your playing, and hopefully, if they think well enough of you, they would consider you, or might reference you to a contractor. The other thing, of course, to do is to find out who the major contractors are who do this type of work, and write them a letter and with a resume. Most do not appreciate you calling them and bugging them at home, but write to them and tell them you're here in New York. Show them what work you've done. To that extent, the best way, I believe, in addition to what I've just mentioned, is to go out and try to do road shows, do shows on the road, international tours, any type of musical theater work, if that's what you want to do, and the type of work you want to get into, so that you build a resume of experience in doing shows, but you also build a network of people who are interested in doing that work as well. And a contractor who I worked for many years named John Miller in New York often says when he speaks to audiences about this, that every single person you meet in the industry is part of your ultimate networking community. And that conductors who are doing road shows now in 10 years will be the conductors doing the shows on Broadway. And I think that has proven to be true in a great many cases. So that if you do road shows and meet other musicians and conductors, perhaps if you're a good player and you impress them and you act like a good colleague and take the work seriously, that ultimately down the line that will prove beneficial in getting employed.
So for me, that raises two questions, though.
Yeah.
I mean, the first one is, in the orchestra world, I think that the idea behind auditions is that so this exact situation does not happen where you have to know someone to get a job. What is it about the Broadway circuit that allows it to be backwards like this, or that allows the union to see that as even desirable? I find that surprising.
Of course, there's no formal auditions. I mean, think about it. Shows, unlike orchestras, which are there for hopefully lifetimes, shows start and end sometimes within months, sometimes within a few years, but there's a constant turnover. Every show is different. Every show's music requirements is different. The number of musicians is different. So, if one were to have auditions for every single book on every single Broadway show coming in, it would be prohibitive, first of all, financially for the producers who are putting on the show. And to be honest with you, the musicians generally are always the last things considered. I mean, you're getting a show up and running. You're getting the book together, the actors. You certainly have to get first and foremost the producers, the backers, the promo for the show. You're getting the creative team together with the choreographer, director, conductor, and then as you get towards the end of that process, then you sit down, you get a musical contractor, and they sit down and work out the personnel for the show. Um, it would be prohibitive. It's not impossible, but it would be costly. And the producers, trust me, do not want to spend any more money on musicians than they are already spending. And we're just hoping to hang on to what we have right now. Quite frankly, we're in negotiations on a new Broadway contract. If we
Well,
ever offered up the fact that we want to have auditions each show, and it would be at the producer's expense, forget it. And if it were on the union's expense, forget it. We'd bankrupt our union.
well, one of the criticisms of the orchestral audition process too is that there's one job and you have people from all over the world flying in for that one job, and how many people's time was wasted uh, over auditioning for a job that might not even pay that much. And in this situation too, I mean, if you're having 2 or 3 auditions a year, I can imagine that the number of people coming and not getting work. I mean, they're just there spending time on something that's not going to go anywhere for
Well,
them.
it's true. Here's an example of what it might appear like. In New York, Radio City Music Hall has two shows now that they audition musicians for as per their specific contract. And that's been going on for
Hmm.
a number of years, on maybe the last 6 or 7 years, perhaps. So they hold auditions for a number of chairs. I think maybe 11 or 12 chairs for the Christmas show, and I think for all the chairs for their spring summer show now. It's advertised in the union paper. There are auditions. You apply for it. Some people are accepted to audition, some not. If you're a doubler, you may be playing five, six, seven horns coming into audition for any one or two chairs. And it's several days of auditions, and they take their, whoever they decide. But it's an incredibly taxing situation. Imagine playing five or six horns, auditioning, and I think they have 1 minute on each instrument to play something, an excerpt that will impress the people behind the curtain. And you go from one instrument to the other right after, no real break. 1 minute on one instrument, 1 minute on the next, 1 minute on the next, and so on. And that's your audition. Uh, I mean, that's as excruciating as it can be. You don't even get a chance to get into a feel on an instrument before you have to go to the next one, and you have to and lay out
Yeah.
something that's generally they're looking for technically impressive players who have decent sounds. And you don't get a chance to play in a section or with anyone. There's no tryout period. It's based on that one little moment. So, to be honest with you, Sean, there is no ideal um, way of establishing personnel, I think, for an orchestra or for a commercial situation. Nothing is going to be perfect, but Broadway now being the prime benefactor of our union as far as the work dues that go in from Broadway to Local 802, it's become a very important gig. And because it pays a livable wage with some benefits, and it's one of the few jobs in New York, other than the Lincoln Center orchestras, that pay a livable wage with benefits, it's become a desirable gig that people 15, 20 years ago wouldn't have even thought of auditioning. Here's a little tidbit. The very first show I did was the original run of Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. It was a Broadway show, sort of, but you know, early '80s, maybe '81 or
Hmm.
'80. Anyway, any event, that was the first show that I had from the beginning as my own show. One of the trumpet players on the show was a terrific trumpet player who's now retired, named Danny Kahn. And Danny was a very funny fellow, but he was also working in the studios quite a bit at that time. I remember him telling me, he said, Eddie, don't tell anyone that I'm doing this show. If John Faddis or Lou Soloff or Alan Rubin, who were among the greatest trumpet players in the world, the top studio guys at the time, if they hear that I'm doing a show, forget it. I'll be blackballed. They'll never talk to me again.
Wow.
It literally was that low on the rung. Today, you'll find the very greatest players. um, in New York and maybe in the country, not only playing a show, but looking to play a show because it's what's left as far as paying a full time livable wage with benefits. So it's interesting how over several generations, this type of work has changed in priority and in desirability.
Well, it's funny because a lot of things change, and this is a really sort of reaching comparison, but it's like back in the day where they used to serve lobster in the prisons, and then lobster kind of over the decades became a delicacy to the point where it's more expensive than the best steaks and things, and years ago, the aristocratic type people never even would have touched it, and now they, you know what I mean? Like it's so musical tastes and musical themes change along with food and everything else in society.
Yeah, and but one thing doesn't change on Broadway. It's 8 shows a week, and when you talk about prison, if you're doing a long running show, it can feel like that. It can take its toll musically and emotionally. Uh, and
So how do you keep your mind active? Like if you're playing 8 shows a week, I mean, I've only ever done short runs of little things with high schools, for
uh,
example, in
uh,
town of this kind of thing. And I find by the end of the fifth show, I can play it while I'm
mhm.
sleeping, and I'm glad it's the last one.
Yes, it varies from show to show and situation to situation. The best circumstances is that one, you're playing with colleagues who are good players, decent people, and in a physical environment that's not toxic, which so many of these theaters are. I mean, the last show that I did full time, we were in a theater, a small theater, and we were enclosed uh, below the stage level, not visible to the audience, and it felt like we were in a submarine for 2.5 hours every day. Literally, and the air was bad. I was playing in that particular gig. It was, if I remember, flute, piccolo, clarinet, maybe some recorders. But I remember a lot of piccolo, and I was playing right into a wall. I mean, I was up against the wall with high piccolo passages, and we had to wear headsets. We were wearing cans to hear one another because we couldn't hear one another acoustically. So I mean, sometimes the physical situation can be worse than the musical situation. Even though you're playing the same music, if the physical situation is not conducive to playing music, it can really take its toll on you. But getting back to your question in a more specific musical response, you have to look for things to engage your mind. One of the things that I try to do is try to transcribe in my mind what other people are playing, or try to figure out the harmonies that are going on as I know my part. When I become comfortable with my part, so that I'm not so worried. Am I going to get the note out? Is it going to be in tune? How am I going to make the transition from one instrument to another? When I get past that point, which varying on the show can take 1 or 2 weeks, and sometimes more if they keep making changes. But um, figuring out the musical surroundings, or listening to, zeroing in on some other players in the pit, uh, that can help. I also play a game that I know a lot of my colleagues do, an equipment game. Okay, what type of equipment is going to work best in this situation? So you start bringing in different mouthpieces, ligatures, reed setups, uh, just figuring out maybe this can sound better, or if nothing else, just occupying your mind with a different setup that day to give you something else to focus on. So you do have to play games a little bit with yourself to keep yourself engaged after you've done a show 30, 40, 50, 500. Imagine the people doing Phantom of the Opera now, 20, I don't know, 27 years, 28 years. I mean, it's ridiculous. How do you,
Is it some of the same people?
believe it or not? Yes.
Oh my
Yeah,
God.
I mean, there's a point where a show is a blessing because at least you have some financial stability when you know you have a hit show. And then there's the other side of the coin where it's a nightmare because it is the same situation, the same physical surroundings, the same people, the same music. Um, it's a difficult thing to juggle, and everyone does it slightly differently, and it depends on your instruments as well. I mean, I think woodwind doublers do it a little differently than percussionists or than brass players, and certainly than string players. The best way to do a Broadway show is to make sure you have plenty of other work to engage you outside of that particular gig. That really is the ideal thing, so that you can still maintain the gig by doing your over 50%, but have enough outside work so that your mind and your musical mind will be engaged, and also that you'll still have contributions to your healthcare plan so that you know all those things will be intact. Uh,
Well, it's interesting you raise this concern about the 50 to 75% because any other kind of person would say, well, I mean, who cares that someone has to be at work the time that they're supposed to be or whatever. But I think that mentally this is going to take a toll on people because they're unable to pursue other things that are stimulating to them, and that also prevents the newer people from coming in.
this is true, and this is the result of musicians now doing shows needing to work at the show more in order to maintain their benefits. Um, the thing you don't want to do is become a factory worker where you're playing the notes, you're not listening, your mind is somewhere else. Sometimes that's almost impossible to avoid at times. And I must admit that I have at times found myself lapsing into that. And one of the things, besides what I've mentioned, that helps me get through it is I simply take off sometimes just to take off. I call it a mental health
Hmm.
day, but basically, I do anything else. Maybe I'll go play golf, or I'll go out, believe it or not, hear a concert, or if there's something in town that's, at the Met Opera or Carnegie, or someone's in town at one of the jazz clubs. I mean, just to take off and do that can be so refreshing. Um, I find a lot of players who get trapped in doing Broadway for a large part of the career, and I hate to say this, but I think it's true. They become gig meisters. They look at the gig and the Broadway show and the next Broadway show and the next Broadway show, and their life revolves totally around that. And usually it shows in their playing. I think if you look at the show as your life, you lose something musically. They forget what excited them in music the first time. And I think it's partly true in an orchestral situation. If you're in an orchestra for 15, 20, 30, 40 years, what excites you anymore? And you have to look for those avenues to excite you. So you may want to do more chamber music playing or do summer festivals or maybe get involved in teaching a little bit on the side at a conservatory, something else to engage your musical mind so that the monotony of being in the same physical location with the same people does not ruin your musical sensitivity.
So there must be things like I feel like we're kind of going down a dark path, and I don't want to discourage
It's okay,
anybody
I'm
here.
used to it.
But like there must be some things that also are rather redeeming about it that you enjoy about having the chance to approach that music as much and as often as
Well,
that. Or would you say it's more a means to an end to pursue other goals?
it's a little bit of both. And
Yeah.
everybody, I think, will have a slightly different take on it. My take on it is sure in an economy like we have now, in a music industry that's downsizing. Sure, it's a survival. It's a steady paycheck that's there every week. But the thing that you can learn from doing a Broadway show is really related to something I mentioned a few minutes ago. It's about equipment. What equipment actually works in certain situations? We can practice at home all we want, but until we're actually in the midst of playing, and especially as a doubler where you're doing, three or four different sets of instruments and multiples of those sometimes, playing all different styles of music. What setups work? What instruments work? What allows you to move from one instrument to the other? And those are the things that I think I have learned most from doing a Broadway show throughout the last, I don't know, 36, 37, 38 years. I have a good sense of what setups for me work for certain styles of music and what don't. And you know what? The good thing is you never 100% correct on that. For instance, I mean, this is just because it's on my mind. I'm going into sub for a colleague of mine tonight on Fiddler on the Roof, which is a revival on Broadway. and it's a pretty good production from what I can discern. But I'm playing the solo clarinet book, the klezmer clarinet book, as it were, and there's a lot of solos toward the end of the first act, beginning of the second act. I mean, there are three major cadenzas, believe it or not, where the conductor basically stops conducting and you're playing. And there are about three or
Hmm.
four other huge solos on top of that, uh, all of which are klezmer type of playing. Now, prior to that and after that, you're in the classical orchestral woodwind section, and you're playing completely different volumes and styles. And so you have to have a setup that can allow you to play with very good pitch and obviously the sound that you're hoping to get, and articulate well enough to blend with oboe, bassoon, another clarinetist, then flute. Um, and then you have to step out and play, uh, a completely different style, a completely different volume, and flexibility to bend notes and flutter and do all sorts of articulations that aren't classical in nature. And so I had started out playing a setup that I thought would accommodate that. The conductor said, I'd like it to be a little louder. And so I ended up moving more towards a jazz setup that had a not too big a tip opening, but allowed me still to play louder than I would on my normal chamber music or orchestral setups. So, you're constantly learning about what works and what doesn't. There's also E flat clarinet on the book, and I went through a lot of changes on my E flat clarinet to play these passages, even though, quite frankly, I don't think it matters at all, and the conductor doesn't give a damn about it. Um, but there was stuff, up to high F sharps and all that, and when you get into the pit and you realize you're playing E flat clarinet in the first number, and the doors have been open to the theater just before you start, and it's quite cold, especially in the wintertime here in New York, and you have to play low register E flat clarinet. Well, that 42 millimeter barrel suddenly becomes a 41 millimeter barrel for the first few numbers until the horn warms up or until the theater warms up. And then you have to
Hmm.
switch because now you've got to play in the top part of the horn, and maybe you don't want to be quite as sharp as especially A, B, and C above the staff. You don't want to be quite sharp there. So I mean,
Well, the versatility thing is so interesting because you're touching on classical, jazz, klezmer. God, what else? I mean, what other styles do you
right,
expect to just
right. Well,
pull
that's
out?
the thing. I mean, and that's if you treat the gig like that and looking to find the best answers. It's sort of like a crossword puzzle. You're trying to fill in the blanks with the best possible answers and hope that it all works together in a uniform whole. Um, and so being a doubler, maybe allows us to get through these type of situations better than, let's say, if you were playing a section violin part in a Broadway show and you're just playing, a lot of whole notes and section work, and you're there for 10 years. Man, I don't know how those people survive that. Maybe that's why they tend to leave the shows. But
So, so let's talk about your setup a
yeah,
little bit. Like we go over your clear clarinet case for tonight. What's in there to get through that gig with the versatility you need?
man. Oh, well, this is, it's right in front of me now, so I can point it out. So I play a Buffet R13 clarinet. Uh, and so I have two different setups, believe it or not. Of course, depending on the temperature there, I have the setup that will play for the klezmer. I have a very old Selmer blank. There's not even a facing on it. I mean, it's probably about 80 years old. And it plays a little
Wow.
high pitch wise, so I can use a 66 millimeter with it and still play above the band, even if it's a little cold. I can pull out if it's a little sharp, but that's a little freer. And then I have my more you say classical setup where I could use that 66 millimeter barrel or even a 67 millimeter barrel and use a Brad Bain mouthpiece that I've been using Brad Bain's mouthpieces for about maybe a decade now, and Brad makes his mouthpieces at 442, so I can play a 66 millimeter barrel in a pit orchestra, even if it's a little cold, and get away with it. So depending on the situation and how my reeds are feeling at the show, I might start out the show playing like the first 45 minutes with the classical setup, and then segue to the jazz setup as I approach the cadenzas at the end of the first act and the beginning of the second act.
So you'll actually switch mouthpiece during
I, I
the
will.
show.
I would rather not, but I've got to satisfy myself first. I mean, if I'm not feeling like I'm blending the section or I can articulate in a more classical style on the jazz setup, then I'll opt to do that. I don't think it's healthy to constantly switch mouthpieces on gigs, to be honest with you. But sometimes the
Hmm.
situation may call for it, and um, I've just got to make sure that I can feel comfortable playing in the musical context. So I'll put myself through that, which again is something I don't know how many people would want to do that, but yeah, I seem to end up being that's just my nature. It's my personality.
What about ligature selection? Do you feel that?
Oh man, did you open up a can of
Oh
worms?
no, are we opening up a can of worms?
A lot of cans of worms. I'm, I, this is. I hate to admit that. Well, you do things when you're younger because you think a ligature is going to be the answer, and sometimes it is.
It's not? No, just
Well,
kidding.
no, sometimes it is. I mean, but it
Yeah,
also
yeah.
depends on the reeds, the time of the year, the mouthpiece you're using, the barrel you're using. If the reed is, a little harder, you might certain ligatures make them softer. If the reed is a little weaker, some ligatures, the way they where they put the pressure, can make them feel a little heavier. So I hate to admit it, I think I probably have at least 50 or more clarinet ligatures in my stock, and I probably have the same for alto sax, less for tenor and soprano and baritone. But I mean, you always want to see if, when there's something new out, if it's helpful. And depending on the
You could
situation,
start a museum.
yeah, but you know what? This week I've been playing over at New York, well, it's called the Coke Theater now, where this New York City Ballet plays. And we were doing West Side Story this week. So I'm playing that alto solo at the beginning. And opted to use an older mouthpiece that was more in use when West Side Story was initiated in the 50s. So I'm using an old Brilhart mouthpiece. And I found that using a Silverstein ligature on it with the new Van Doren V21 reeds was the best combination to play that. I did not start
Hmm.
out with that combination at all, but during rehearsals, I realized, this is where I had to go in that for that piece of music in that theater with that orchestration. So I mean, that's part of the fun of it. Where you're even if you've done a piece of music a lot, like West Side Story, everyone's probably done it, at least now. It's such a popular piece, but dealing with what sounds the best at a particular moment can lead you to different directions, and so maybe it's a diversion, but I think also from a musical standpoint, the correct ligature combination with reed and mouthpiece and in the environment, the physical environment you're playing, can lead you in different directions. So, you know, that's how I sort of treat gigs that are recurring type of gigs, or, or literally a Broadway show where you're playing the same music every night.
With the environment, you actually remind me of a question I wanted to ask last time but forgot. Um, Reeds are so susceptible to changes,
Oh,
and like,
really?
would you believe it? It's snowing here today.
Is it
It's
really?
this is after a week. We were in the high 30s in Celsius. So what is that in Fahrenheit? I don't know, but yeah, it was
Wow.
July weather all
Right.
week, and then wake up this morning, it's snowing.
Gee.
Um, so, but for you, like managing seven instruments, the reeds, that's seven times the problem. And as the reeds get bigger, the problems get worse. So, what do you do? Are you into the synthetic reeds at all, or are you spending a lot of time on the reeds, or what's your
Well,
thought on that?
I'm not into synthetic reeds. I know a lot of people who are. Um, to my ears, the best synthetic reed does not equate at this moment in time still with excellent cane reeds. Now, that being said, finding cane reeds that are really satisfying you totally, ooh, it's not an easy chore, and it's not it's not something that one can just say can count on every day, just pulling out a box and taking out some reeds. So I do spend a lot of time with my reeds. I spend more time now than I used to. I also more careful now about how I save the reeds from day to day, making sure there's always some little humidity control in them. I even put my reeds when I get them into a cigar box, humidity controlled wooden cigar box until I open them. So I'm trying to do as much as I can to preserve their uh, sanity because because quite frankly the price of reeds is absurd today, and the cane, in spite of what every reed maker says, the cane has suffered, and I think part of it is due to our climate change and the environment, and what's minerals are in the earth, how the cane is grown. Also, cane I think is probably cut a little sooner than it should be, and maybe it's not left to dry as much as it should be. All those factors: climate, environment, of course, and then finances. So, we're on the receiving end, and we've got to make the most we can with the reeds we have. So I think even more than maybe 30, 40, 50 years ago, you have to know what you're doing with the reeds and in shaping them to what you want. How to maneuver them, how to sustain them, how to preserve them. It's really become more essential, at least from my point of view. Um, and
What is your main thought on adjusting the reeds? Because a lot of clarinet players, myself
uh,
included, have often been timid about adjusting because we don't have to do it as much as like an oboist would, and you just never get as good at it as you'd like. So, what knife do you use, and what techniques
well,
do you want to share?
I think I kind of disagree with that. I mean, yes,
Oh, really?
even if we're using commercially made reeds, the amount of time we have to spend if we really want to do it right is substantial. It's
Mm-hmm.
and I think a lot of the problem is the breaking in process. It's one thing to know where to go on the reed to make a certain adjustment, but the first part, the breaking in, takes a great deal of patience and time. And I'm still trying to improve that in my world. I mean, I don't think we can give enough time to the breaking in process. I mean, I think several weeks is probably what we need minimally. I tend to be more on the maybe a week break-in process. By week, I mean taking the reeds out of the box, unsealing them, letting them just sit in the environment for an hour, doing nothing. Let it just sit and for the reed to get accustomed to the environment that we're now putting it in. Then I put them back in the box, or I put them back in a humidity-controlled packet. Next day, I might wet them a little bit. I mean, a little bit, like 15, 20 seconds in some, uh, mildly, uh, mildly warm water. Take them out, rub the water off, and maybe rub the water into the cane a little bit, trying to seal it. Let them dry, put them away. Next day, the same thing. Maybe by the third or fourth day, I'll play just a few notes on each one just to get a sense. Still sealing them, putting them away. And that, as long as you can sustain that for maybe even a week before playing the reeds real hard, just letting the reeds get accustomed, let them expand, contract, getting them to basically be more consistent and settled. I think then you can make a better assessment of the reeds before you start cutting. That being said, I'm just like everyone else. There are times when nothing is playing. I'll open up a box reed, put the first one that plays well enough on, and have to do the gig that way. But if I'm really on my game, that's what I do for every set of reeds, whether it be alto sax, tenor, soprano sax, clarinet, E flat clarinet. I mean, every one of them deserve, has to be treated with that same respect, and that's a lot of time. Now
Mm-hmm.
that's also one of the reasons why I never wanted to play a double reed. I thought, man, forget it. I'll never play music again. If I'm doing this with the single reeds, now I've got to, learn how to. work and manufacture my own reeds, forget it. It just that, but again, that's my personality. Some people are perfectly content. Take the reed out of the box, play it, put it away. Um, and I know some orchestral players who do it. I studied with a gentleman who was the assistant principal clarinet of the New York Philharmonic for many decades. His name was Peter Semenauer. He was just a wonderful man and a great player. B flat, E flat clarinet, just spectacular. And Peter every year would have about 400 boxes of Van Doren reeds split between, B flat reeds and E flat reeds in his studio. And he would take out whatever reed from a box, play it. Those that didn't, he threw them away. He didn't want to be bothered with working on them and spending the time. And that's how he survived. That was his approach. And, I know a number of people who do that.
400 boxes?
Unbelievable. He lived in Montclair, New Jersey, and I remember going in the studio. This entire studio was surrounded by, well, in those days, Van Doren boxes, were the purple yellow kind, and I just couldn't believe it. And he said, "Yeah, that's 1 year's stock," and I just didn't understand it. And then he explained, but that's how he dealt with it. And you know what? If you have that kind of money and or that kind of relationship with the company, maybe that's the way to do it, so you don't go too nuts with the reeds. But you do have to know how to prepare the reeds before you start working on them. And then working on them is another thing. And I was fortunate to study a great deal with Joe Allard, who was quite adept at adjusting reeds. And I also worked with a fellow who was not that well known. He was mostly a big band player, but very gifted with reeds. His name is John Signorelli. And he shared a lot of information with me on stuff. So, and every teacher that I had, I gained a little bit from. So, you're always an accumulation of those who you worked with. And I've tried
Mm-hmm.
to incorporate as much of their knowledge. And of course, there were many fine books on reed making, particularly like the Cal Opperman book and also Ben Armato's book, Perfect to Read. So, I mean, whatever information you can get, you try and see what works for you, and that which works, you keep. If it doesn't, you just don't use it. So I make use of, I generally like double beveled knife. I like particular one I have. It has a rosewood handle. I get it from Forest Music. And I also like to work with reed rush a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Generally, when I need to move more cane off the reed, I'll use the knife first and then follow it with the rush. That generally, is my go-to approach. I always work the reed from the bottom up, just like building a house. I do it from the cut up towards the tip area. I try to avoid the tip area at all costs. That's the last resort because, especially today where there's so little cane going into the tip, I want to preserve that. And I also try to stay away from the middle of the reed. I work from the bottom of the reed towards the edges, towards the sides, with the knife facing towards the sides. In other words, not straight up and down. And sometimes just working at the bottom of the cut, especially if it's a filed reed, there's a little residue of bark you want to remove. Sometimes that alone can make the difference enough. So it's a matter of constantly taking a little off, trying, taking a little off, trying. Um, I only use reed trimmers as a last resort if the reed gets too soft. Generally, I find that when you use a reed trimmer, you have to recalibrate the whole balance of the reed. So it's like starting again for me. But it's quite frankly a lot of trial and error, and you have to go by the feel. The other thing that I think most players that I see working on reeds don't do is they don't have a consistent way for trying the adjustments. In other words, what are your test means for trying the adjustments? They tend to blow into it the reed too hard. I tend to go the opposite way. Like I'll blow the littlest amount of air without using my tongue and pivoting the reed and mouthpiece on one side of my mouth so that one side of the reed is not touching my lip and teeth, in essence. So, for instance, if I wanted to try the left side of the reed, I'm going to pivot the mouthpiece and reed on the right side and blow the softest amount of air I can without any articulation, just and seeing what it takes to start the read. So my basic thing is I always want to be able to start the sound with the littlest amount of air possible to play a pianissimo without any choking or any biting or any type of constraint. If I can begin to start the sound that way and do it evenly from both sides, in other words, the left side and the right side of the reed respond to that same small amount of air equally well, that gives me a start. And then, of course, I want to make sure that I have a reed that's heavy enough in the middle that has enough cane to sustain the upper parts of the horn and playing loudly as well. So, I mean, that's in a very short, abbreviated description of my general approach. And then if the articulation is that it doesn't respond so well, or there are different adjustments one does, maybe a little bit at the tip. And again, when I work at the tip, it's not with a knife. It'll only be with a reed rush, which is much more subtle than any knife can be. So, again, everyone is different, and everyone has a different way they want to hear the sound and the response they're looking for. But I generally want to be able to have any setup that I have on any of my instruments respond to an air attack, if you want to call it that, without tongue, with the softest amount of air, the smallest amount of air being blown. I want to be able to hear the sound sort of emanate from the air.
So last time on the show, you mentioned, I think you have over 20 instruments.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's.
I guess some of them are
Oh,
the
yes.
same, but
Yeah, I mean, this is typical of any doubler, quite frankly.
so, but like you're having to budget your practice time already so diligently,
Yeah.
probably. How much time additionally are you spending on reads? Are we talking a couple hours a day, or I mean, what's the?
Impossible to be that specific. It varies from day to day, and like tonight, I've got to play E flat, B flat clarinet as far as the reeds. So after I finish with you, that'll be my first. That'll be my first endeavor, and then I'll be able to know how much time I can spend on the reeds and how much I can actually spend, warming up properly. I may not be able to get down to the gym to work out today if the reeds are going to be problematic, and that's every day. I mean, they could have played well yesterday or the day before, and as we all know, today's another story. So there's it. It's impossible to put a specific amount, but I would say this, that the people who have the greatest opportunity to spend the greatest amount of time with reeds are those who are students. And when you're at school and you're studying, you think, oh man, I got all these classes and tests, but believe me, it's the greatest time to really learn about this and to devote time with the reeds, because when you're in the professional situation and you've got to produce day to day, and your time is limited, especially as a multiple wind player, and the musical demands of what's in front of you, which changes every day, makes that happen. Whereas at school you'll have musical demands, but generally you'll play one or two concerts a semester. I mean, as a professional musician, you may be playing 3 or 4 concerts every week, different music and different requirements. So it's a different ballgame when you're a full-time professional.
So for the lightning round, these are all questions answered in under a minute. Just real quick, if I were to walk over to your music stand right now, what would I find? And I have a feeling you're going to say Fiddler on the Roof.
No, I'm not going to do that. No,
Oh,
I've
no.
done that enough. I know what I have to do. So that I'm going to be
Okay.
playing that for 3 hours tonight. No, I actually have the West Side Story that I alluded to earlier, because I have that coming up all this weekend. I have Cavallini Caprices for clarinet on my stand.
Hmm?
I've got The Modern Flutist, which is a book of a lot of etudes and orchestral excerpts for flute on my stand. Got the Taffanel Goldberg complete edition for flute on my stand.
You got a big music stand.
Well, yeah, I do actually. And also, I have a lot of my music here on my couch, sitting in front of me. I have a book of Cannibal Adderley transcriptions because I love Cannibal, and I like to use the transcriptions, especially when I'm trying equipment to, if I'm trying to capture a certain sound and whatnot. The Marquardt Flute Study, which is a daily exercise book that William Kincaid, the great American flutist, used to have all the students do. I'm trying to memorize that book, actually. It's a slow process. And then, believe it or not, I have the Brahms Quintet on the stand because with some colleagues, we're thinking about trying to get together and play a little concert this summer with the Brahms. So, it's a mixed bag of stuff, which is what I like. But it does present its problems when you certainly like when you're getting into the Brahms Quintet. You don't want anything else in your palette. I mean, you don't want any other distractions musically or anything, and that's totally consuming in and of itself. And so, when it comes time as we get closer, all the other stuff I take off the stand. I actually put it in another room so I can't see it. I don't let it distract me. I really have to do that sometimes because sometimes you're thinking, well, gee, I heard this thing on the radio, man. I want to play alto tonight, and you've got to play something else the next day. So that's that.
You got to stop yourself.
Yeah, those are the moments when you say, "Gee, I wonder what it would have been like just to play one instrument your whole life."
Well, I think they have a lot less music on their stand because if you got the method books you think about for clarinet, then times that by flute and saxophone and
Yeah,
whatever else. I
yeah.
mean, all of a sudden you got
Oh,
probably hundreds of
oh,
books, eh?
man, it's a sad scene here. I'm telling you, there's just a lot of music out here, and I think I'm pretty organized, but no one would know that coming into the room.
It's your own type of order.
Exactly.
What's your all-time favorite piece of music or album?
That's going to change from day to day. I'll say that a few.
What is it right now?
Right now, man, I still come back to Charlie Parker with strings. Bird with strings is one of my favorite albums of all types of music. But I guess from just playing the music a lot and having greater and greater respect for Rachmaninoff, Symphonic Dances, which was his last piece, is still in my ear because I've been doing it so much, and it's just one of the more amazing scores, musically speaking, orchestrationally, and of course, wonderful little sax solo toward the beginning of the piece. But it's just a great piece of music. So those are what's on my mind at the moment.
Along those same lines, if you could go back in time and meet any composer, or even a living composer or musician, who would it be?
Well, a composer, it'll fluctuate between only because a little more contemporary between Stravinsky and Debussy, both voices I love. I would have loved to have been able to just see in person, which I never did, and I'm unhappy about that. See Duke Ellington. But as far as a musician, two musicians stand out. I really wish just to have a chance to talk with them, meet them. It would have been Charlie Parker, Bird, and Jascha Heifetz,
Hmm.
because to me they represent in each of their respective fields the ultimate, uh, the ultimate of what a musician can accomplish.
Do you have a particular book you'd like to recommend to the
Well, since
audience?
it's a clarinet audience, there is a book that's not that well known. And I was thinking about this when you told me we might be doing this type of lightning round. There's a book by an Italian instrument maker named Ernest Ferron, Ferron, that was translated into English maybe 10, 15 years ago, and it's called The Clarinet Revealed. And it is
Hmm.
available. You go to Amazon. It's a paperback edition, very affordable. It talks about the physics of the instrument in a way that's much uh, more together and a little easier to understand than most. I still think Arthur Benade's great books on the fundamentals of music acoustics is the Bible. But for those of us who are not physics majors. Ernest Ferron's book, The Clarinet Revealed, does explain a lot of this stuff that we deal with on the clarinet in a way that we can all understand and maybe get a better understanding of how we're going to deal with our equipment and why things, you know, happen on the clarinet that seem not to make sense, acoustically speaking.
I'm gonna put a link to that in the show notes there, and I should check that one out myself. I
Yeah,
haven't
it's
read it.
not well known. I'm thankful for the repairman. Believe it or not, a saxophone repairman, Bill Singer in New York here, turned me on to it. Ernest Ferron also had another book for the saxophone, by the way. It's called The Saxophone Is My Voice. So both of those books are available and really quite affordable here in America. I think maybe they're around $20 each or so forth. Um,
Hmm.
but superb books dealing with the physics of the clarinet and, of course, the saxophone.
Let's not forget about your book too. There, I'm gonna put that
Okay.
link to that in the show notes, and I would highly recommend that a lot of people in the audience here check that out. It was a great. I haven't finished reading it. Obviously, it's like 500 pages of intense information,
Yeah,
but
it's
I'm working my way
me
through
too. I tell you,
it.
not to be smug or anything, but I think I've learned more writing the book than I would have had someone else written it because going through the process and now rereading it, it's there's a lot of information we need to have as musicians and that can help us. And it allows us to teach ourselves. And I'm glad I went through this process, although it took me about 15 years. I learned a lot about music that I don't think I ever would have or didn't even know existed.
What is an instrument that you'd love to play but never learned? And I know this is maybe an odd question for a doubler because I feel like maybe the instruments you wanted to spend the time with you did.
Yeah.
But
Well, it's the first. My first instrument was piano because my mom taught it to me. She played piano, and I play enough, like you might say, musician piano, or but not anywhere near where I'd be comfortable ever saying I can play piano. That's the instrument. I think the piano is the instrument that we all must play, and we must play well. And I don't play that well enough. And one of my dreams was to have a Steinway grand, like a Hamburg Steinway, in my house to be
yeah.
able to wake up every morning and play tunes or even just play Bach chorales or fugues. I think I think the keyboard is the essential instrument, and that still gnaws at me that I don't play well enough.
Yeah, I think a lot of people feel that way about piano. It's such an enticing, myself included. I've started going back a bit here, trying to get my skills up, but now it's hard to find the time, right?
It's true, but I mean, even just to be able to have the chops to play some of the Beethoven sonatas or Chopin nocturnes, or just the incredible literature written for that, or to be able to improvise and voice like Bill Evans or McCoy Tyner in another direction. I mean, it's it's
Score reductions.
everything. The whole world is
Yeah.
available to you when you have the piano as your instrument, and I really hope I can somehow find more time and consistent time to practice piano in the future.
Yeah, it's true. As wind players, we're always sort of confined, not necessarily the best word maybe, but we are confined to ensemble playing, really. I mean, it's not just as clarinet after a while is, not going to entice everybody, and something like a piano can really fill out the
Well,
intricacies of the harmony
it's
and the
true. I mean, the other thing being said, I mean, the piano has the greatest music written for it within the Western European classical tradition. There's no question about that.
Mhm.
But within the woodwinds, there is also no question. And the clarinet has the greatest music written for it. There's no woodwind instrument that has the chamber music written for it. I mean, flute and clarinet have equal amount of fantastic orchestral solos. But
Yes.
regarding chamber music, there's no close second. The clarinet, the quality of the chamber music written for clarinet by the greatest composers is spectacular. And
Very lucky
yep,
Brahms, that he was able to do what
and
he did
Mozart.
for that instrument. Mozart, yeah, of course.
I mean
No,
Debussy,
it's very
Schumann. I
true.
mean, just go Schubert, go down the list, and it's the works that we have from these great artists. It's really astonishing. But again, nothing is like the piano.
Yeah. So, we discussed this in the last episode, but where can we find you
Oh,
online?
okay. Well, my website is joffewoodwinds.com, Joffe Woodwinds, as one word.com. And I have a professional Facebook page with Joffe Woodwinds on Facebook as the go-to. So, I'm not a heavy social media person. I just like to do it, I guess you might say, the old-fashioned way. But that would be the best way. And my email, Ed Joffe, is one word, EDJOFFE, at iCloud.com.
So, just so listeners are aware, you've got a pretty great website set up there with a lot of great resources, including your own set of interviews with amazing musicians in New York. There, I believe, is where you're doing the
Yeah.
interviews. Who are some guests you've had on there? Do you want to say
Oh,
something
sure.
about
Well,
that, quick?
thanks. I set up these set of video interviews about 2 years ago, just as an educational means, really. It was something I wanted to do, and a colleague of mine who's a great trombone player in New York, Mike Davis, has been doing this for the brass world for maybe a decade. And we worked the show together, and that's the other thing. Working shows, you meet a lot of musicians that maybe you wouldn't have a chance to, or that on a peripheral level. But now when you're working every day in the same environment, you really get a chance to know them. And I've met some of the greatest musicians in the world and learned so much from them doing shows. And Mike is certainly one of them. And so as a result of seeing what he did on his website, I got inspired and started doing these interviews. The first one I did was with a studio musician, woodwind doubler, who's probably the most successful one of my generation in New York, Lawrence Feldman. I followed that with one of my favorite jazz musicians, alto saxophonist Charles McPherson, and subsequently did those also with another alto saxophonist, Jerry Dodgen, clarinetist Larry Guy, who's also a tremendous music educator. Uh, I did some with some oboe doublers in New York, Rick Heckman and Dan Willis. I recently completed one with some bassoon doublers, baritone bassoon doublers, Ron Janelli, Roger Rosenberg, and Alan Wan. Let's see, I have one coming up with, believe it or not, four great woodwind repairmen. That'll be out in June. I had collected, some of my favorite woodwind repair people in New York, and that included Bill Singer, Tony Salambini, the great clarinet repairman Mark Jacoby, and Tomoji Hirakata. Let's see. Oh, I also did a video with Broadway conductors, three Broadway conductors and music directors to, have them talk about, their considerations when they hire musicians and what they're looking for in musicians and the status of Broadway theater. And I think the final one that I didn't mention was very, very famous flute teacher and player Keith Underwood, who did a tremendous video with me and talked about some great teaching tools and techniques, not only for flute, but really that can be applicable to clarinet and saxophone, especially with regard to breathing. So,
Well, yeah, you got a ton of great stuff up
yeah.
there, and I must say that the video element really adds to it. But it must be a whole new level of work as far as putting all that
And
together. And so,
well,
thanks
yeah,
for
well,
doing
as you
that.
know, putting any of these type of interviews together takes a lot of time. But yeah, it's it's a lot of time and money. But I do enjoy it, and I have to say I've learned something from every single interview, and I've known all of these people for many years, in some cases for 40 years, and I've learned stuff there at these interviews that never came up during all the time that I knew them, and so I consider them lessons for myself, actually.
Yeah, I kind of look at it the same way a little bit, and it's funny because I realized, looking back, how much more I even know about people that I've never met in person, but that I don't know the same things about my own personal teachers. So I'm trying to get some of the people that you know,
Right, right. No,
because you don't sit around and talk about that stuff in a lesson, right?
really,
So
in most cases, no. So it adds to the. I hope it adds to the overall conversation in woodwind world. But it's fun. It's fun doing it, and it's fun hearing back from people who like it, and some people who I haven't heard from for many years, and all of a sudden they saw it, and said some nice things, and we began a conversation that way.
Yeah, no, I think it's
You know,
great. So we've had a long conversation. This spans 3 episodes, and I want to thank anyone who's taken the time to listen to all these. I think we had some real value here, though. We covered three totally different
yeah.
topics. If you haven't checked out the previous episodes, make sure you head back and listen to episode 1 and 2 here, or part 1 and 2, sorry. That featured conversation about Ed's book and his CD and his career as a multi-instrumentalist with doubling. Is there anything else you'd like to add to this sort of marathon we had
Yeah, we
here, Ed?
did. And thanks for doing that. I hope it's not a waste of time for those listening. Um,
Absolutely
but
not. Absolutely not.
maybe just one word that something that does concern me a lot today with regard to woodwind playing, and that is to investigate and to give time, serious time, investigating the playing, the recordings of the great players from other generations. And since we're a clarinet site, particularly here, for me, I find it disarming in speaking to younger players who know nothing of the playing, don't even know the names, but certainly don't know the recordings of, some of the great players like Louis Cahuzac, Daniel Bonad, Ralph McLean, Harold Wright, Robert Marcellus, Carl Leister, from you know early 20th century, mid 20th century into towards the end of the 20th century. That I mean, these were magnificent musicians, and they're just those are just a half a dozen that I rattled off, but. I think it's important to understand and listen to and have a knowledge of what they sounded like, what music they made, how they made it. By the way, I left out Stanley Drucker. Oh man, I better not do that. I won't hear the end of that. But I mean, these are people who were substantial players, major influences, and it seems to me a lot of people today just are concerned with those who have the gigs at the moment and don't really care about the history. This is not just the clarinet world, by the way. It is absolutely the flute world and the saxophone world as well. Um, and I think we're missing something really essential and important. So, I would always recommend, especially with YouTube today, researching the great clarinet voices of other eras and seeing what they had to offer because you might find something that might just touch you in a way that you might not be hearing today. And then the other thing for the students, when you get out of school and you have your degree and you have it mounted on the wall, just remember that that degree means absolutely nothing when it comes to being a professional musician. The constant study and attention to being a professional and learning and evolving uh, is only you get a tad bit of that at school, just the littlest notion. When you get out of school is when we find out if you really deserve to even be considered as someone who wants to be a professional musician. It's really a lot to it, and it's not just playing the notes. Uh,
Well, I like what you said there about the looking up to kind of past stars in the instrumental history sort of thing because I actually one time or sometimes I go to a school and I'll ask what inspired you to play clarinet, and I think that with kids who pick guitar they often know like, oh, I love Jimi Hendrix,
right.
or oh, I like Imagine Dragons or whatever band they're into. But with clarinet the answer is often rather, I don't know if it's unsettling, but it's a little disappointing. They'll say like, well, my brother played it,
Yeah.
or
Yeah.
Squidward plays it
Mhm.
on SpongeBob SquarePants, and they never say. Only very rarely actually does someone say, "Man, I listened to a recording, or I saw an orchestra, and I was like, that's
Right.
my sound."
Right.
They don't think about it
Right.
that way, and I think that although that is okay, at some point you kind of have to go, well, what is my inspiration for
Right.
this? It doesn't come out of
Right.
thin air, or maybe it
And in
does. I
some
don't know.
cases, look, it may come out from Audie Shore, or Benny Goodman, or Buddy DeFranco, or Jimmy Hamilton, or in more recent times Eddie Daniels. I mean, it doesn't have to be just a classical approach, let's say with regard to clarinet, but there's a lot to be learned and a lot to be enjoyed by investigating that which came before. And I'd just like to end with a statement that I heard Charles Mingus, the great jazz bass player, make. I'm not sure if I said this on a prior episode. I may have, but if I'm repeating myself, so be it. Um, that Mingus said what he wanted to hear in the sound of a bass player, he wanted to hear the history of the bass in that sound. And
No,
and
interesting.
I kind of feel more and more as I get older, more and more like that. I want to hear something that reflects some of the history of the instrument as well as, whatever the individual brings to it. And if it doesn't have that history in it, somehow for me, I turn off to it. I mean, that's just me. But I think there is something to be gained by looking back. And the interesting thing, all of the greatest players from different eras, if you listen to them and read about what they said, they were listening to others too. You didn't become a great player just falling out of the sky. There's always a basis for someone's individuality. No one is a totally unique artist unto themselves.
Standing on the shoulder of giants.
Well,
The,
if we're,
you know.
that's, I think we have to search for that.
Well, thanks so much for coming on the show today, Ed, and for the other episodes as well, and sharing all your massive knowledge with the audience. It's really
Well,
appreciated.
thanks for having me, Sean. I tend to talk too much, but I love this stuff so much, and you know, I just want to see. I don't want to see things forgotten. I want to see things get better. I don't want to see what's happening in the music world mirror what's happening in our political world. I want to see things get better and make musical intelligence more of a mainstream thing. And thanks for doing these podcasts, man. It's just great.
Sanding, shaping, balancing. For centuries, mastering your instrument meant mastering these crafts too. But now, D'Addario is redefining craftsmanship for the 21st century by refining their reeds and mouthpieces with technology built from the ground up. By using the world's most innovative techniques to deliver consistently what was once made variable by hand, D'Addario ensures excellence right out of the box as standard, not a surprise. So you can spend less time sanding, shaping, and balancing, and more time perfecting your own craft. To learn more about the new era of craftsmanship from D'Addario Woodwinds, visit d'addario.com/woodwinds.